My name is Lorraine Grubert, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the Peace and Justice Task Force. For tonight's event, a follow-up to themes that we were working on for the past few years. We actually had Professor Wolff here, I think about a year ago. This is the economy, and everyone was pretty taken by his talk about capitalism and how we got to where we are right now. But a lot of people wanted to know what next. Well, tonight we're going to find out what is next, and we can thank the Big Apple Coffee Party, who have asked us to join them in this initiative to create this program. And now I'd like to turn it over to one of the other members of the Big Apple Coffee Party.
Hi, on behalf of the Big Apple Coffee Party, I want to welcome you and thank you for coming out tonight. The Big Apple Coffee Party is a group of local grassroots activists in New York. It's a nonpartisan organization, but we are connected with the National Coffee Party USA. We focus on issues. So we have been working a lot on getting money out of politics, and we are involved in a campaign to get people to stay away from Koch brothers products. There are flyers out there if you want to see what we hand out in front of supermarkets. But then we started to think about the economy and how important it is. And it seemed an issue that was really timely, so we wanted to find out the leading edge of thought on the subject, so we assembled a panel of experts, and our wonderful moderator, Jesse Myerson, will tell you about them in a moment. He's an activist and journalist and scholar who is one of the co-hosts of a podcast called Disorderly Conduct, along with one of our panelists, Alexis Goldstein. And I will now hand the program over to him. Thank you so much.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. If we could take a moment and silence anything that might make noise. There are many, everyone's got something that'll beep. Maybe you had the foresight to turn it off already. I'll give you another couple seconds. I think you've all got a program, right? So maybe I don't have to go through everyone's bio, because if you would like to refer to your programs, you'll get all the information. But let's sort of briefly go down just so that you have a sense of what you can expect everyone to talk about. We'll start all the way on the end. Marc Armstrong is the executive director of the Public Banking Institute. We were just talking about his work going around the country, giving speeches and strategizing about ways of building up public banks. I'm sure he will talk about the North Dakota Bank and maybe his work with the post office, the U.S. Post Office. And if you'd like any more, please refer to the program. Next to him is Alexis Goldstein. She spent, 7 years on Wall Street? And quit. I met her, she was at Zuccotti Park when we were doing Occupy Wall Street, sort of spearheading the authorship of the Occupy the SEC comment letter. Usually the only people who would write comment letters on financial regulation reforms would be banks, and instead this time we had Alexis and some comrades. They hand-delivered it to the SEC, and Alexis is, I think, one of the best secret weapons we have, because she knows all the dirt they do. To her left, not politically maybe, but certainly spatially, is Omar Freilla. Is that right? Excellent. He founded the Green Worker Cooperatives, and he will be talking about workers' cooperatives around the country, and hopefully especially in the Bronx, which is when I became familiar with your work. And then to his left is Professor Richard Wolff. He's the Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, one of the leading heterodox economics departments in the country, one of my favorite euphemisms. And he's now a visiting professor at the New School downtown in our very own fair city. Any more you need. He's the author of numerous books and many lectures and online courses that you should all watch and take if you are interested in what he has to say. That's our panel. Let's give him a handy round of applause. And I think without any further ado, I will turn it over to the good professor who will take us through his opening remarks.
Sure. Thank you all. I'm smiling. I want you to notice, please, that I'm smiling. And I'll tell you why. I know it's only a year since I've been here, but in that year, the economy has taught me a few things, as it has you too, if you think about it. Things have changed. But I have to say to you what I probably said at the beginning of my last talk. I'm going to spend about half the time telling you what is going on, and then half the time that I have, the half hour I have, to tell you where I think the solutions lie. But I want you to know that I'm just a messenger. If what I have to tell you gets you down, don't get angry at me. I haven't the power to have created any of this, but I haven't the inclination to pretend. If you want pretense about what's going on, then the radio and the television will provide all that you can possibly need. Okay, to talk about the economy, I got to separate the long run from the short run. There are things happening in the American economic system that are long run in nature and have as one, there's a light show. No, I'm sorry, we were just trying to get the audience lights down. Okay, fine. There are long-term things of which this crisis is a short-term symptom. But in order to understand the symptom, you got to understand what it's the symptom of. So let me try to do that in a short amount of time as best I can. We are dealing with a global capitalist system, where once it was very scary to talk about capitalism in this country for most of the last half century, because it was thought somehow inappropriate or a sign of disloyalty. We're maturing slowly as a people, and we can now talk about capitalism the way, for example, Europeans managed to do over the last half century without visible negative effects on their societies. So I'm going to talk about capitalism, because capitalism is going through an absolutely fundamental change that's going to affect every person in this room, and so you might as well know. Basically, capitalism begins in England 300 years ago, more or less, as a dominant system. And it spreads from England to Western Europe, and from Western Europe to North America, and from North America and Western Europe to Japan. And then the story sort of stops for a while. That is, capitalism for the last 200, 300 years has concentrated itself in its industrial centers in those three parts of the world: Western Europe, North America, and Japan. And very interestingly, as these capitalist centers developed, they needed to do something to solve their problems. They were a successful system coming out of the collapse of the previous system, feudalism, in Europe, and they quickly realized that they needed to draw things from outside into them. They needed people to come off of the countryside to come in there and work. If they were going to grow their businesses, they needed that. People. And once the people had left the countryside and come into the city, they now needed food to come in from the countryside to feed the people who were now in the city. And they needed the raw materials that their growing industries would work on, which came from the same surrounding area. We're going to call that for the moment the hinterland that was around these industrial centers. Think of an industrial center as Boston, or in England, Manchester, or in France, Lille, or in Germany, Dusseldorf, and in Italy, Milan, and so forth. Capitalist centers with a hinterland. And it worked real well. It did change the European countryside. The distinction town and country was developed then. It didn't exist in most of feudalism, most of its 1,000-year history. So Europe, Western Europe, North America, Japan. When they ran out of hinterland in their own little region, they globalized it. That's called colonialism and imperialism. They went around the world and made the whole rest of the world their hinterland, the source from which people come, especially the United States, but also the source for food and raw materials, and also later markets, places where this capitalist center could sell their output. So we had a world divided into centers and periphery, centers and hinterland. In the centers, something very interesting happened. Masses of people yanked off the countryside, drawn into these centers, lived in awful conditions. You all know that because you somewhere read the novels of Charles Dickens, or the novels of Emile Zola, or Maxim Gorky, or Jack London, lots of people who documented the horrible problems and conditions. And slowly movements developed among these workers saying, hey, we don't want these cities like this, and we don't want these jobs, and we don't want these wages. Make a long story short, in the centers of capitalism, successfully reproducing capitalist enterprises, a deal had to be made with these angry workers that the system couldn't do without, but couldn't cope with either. And the deal was this: you leave us in charge of the businesses. We're the capitalists. We'll decide what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits. But we'll give you rising wages. Shut up, and we'll give you rising wages. And over those 200 years, the wages slowly, steadily rose. Not only did the wages rise in Western Europe, North America, and Japan, but these organizations of workers won benefits from the government. They would pay taxes, but they'd get something. Public education, roads, highways, stuff. And it was really interesting that in the Western Europe, North America, and Japan, wages slowly rose. At the same time that the globalized hinterland had the exact opposite effect everywhere else. Fast forward with me, it's 1970s. By this time, the wages in Western Europe, North America, and Japan are relatively high, and the wages in Asia, Africa, and Latin America are abysmal. Enter two phenomena. I'm obviously being schematic, but I have limited time. Two developments, the jet engine and the modern telecommunications internet. The jet engine makes every corner of the globe available in a matter of hours. And the internet makes it possible to monitor, to see, to control, to count whatever is being done in any facility any corporation has. A warehouse, a factory, an office, a store. We can monitor it from New York, whether it's in Shanghai or Khartoum or Lagos or any place else. Capitalists began to understand, particularly in the 70s, a fundamental change had happened, which we're living through. And I won't embarrass you how many of you figured it out already. Capitalists understood we don't need to keep paying these high wages that these people, these workers in North America, Western Europe, and Japan have gotten out of us over 200 years. We can move. Jet engines and telecommunications, we don't need it to stay here. We can go to the rest of the world where we've driven down the wages and get away with paying those people next to nothing. 3 weeks ago, there was a huge demonstration of 250,000 people through the streets of Dhaka in Bangladesh. Biggest demonstration in a long time. They were demanding a minimum wage of $100 a month, because their current minimum is $38 a month. Who's going to compete with that? Nobody's going to stay in Cincinnati if they can do this in Dhaka. Starting in the 1970s, and I'm going to over-dramatize, but not by much, capitalism in Western Europe, North America, and Japan said, goodbye. We're out of here. And we're never coming back. You know, you Americans, they said in so many words. By the way, some of them say it in just these words. I got this from them. Okay? We're out of here. We don't need you. We're leaving. We're going to make much more money. It's so cheap out there. We can produce there, schlep it all the way back here, and still make more money than if we paid you here. We're gone. And suddenly, it became clear that not only are the jobs going, with the result in the wages collapsing, But it's also now for these companies no longer interesting, the United States. When they have some public relations they want to establish it in the place they're going to, not the place they're leaving. So they'll endow the university chair at the University of Hyderabad, not the University of Pittsburgh. And they're going to set up their advertising program for China, not for Chicago. What happens here in the United States is a new phenomena that's going to shape our politics. The American working class, in short, you, are discovering that the old deal is over. Capitalism once said to you, we will control what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits, but we'll give you a rising wage. The new deal is, we will control what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profit, and you will please enjoy a declining wage. Have a really nice day. That's it. And if you want to understand it, go to the places where it's really been going on since the 70s. Go to Detroit. Go to Cleveland. Go to Camden, New Jersey. Go to the town I was born in, Youngstown, Ohio. Just go. Just look. Just walk around. You won't need advanced rocket science or economics to understand what's going on. That's the future of the whole country. Will there be a few centers of capitalism left? Yes, sure. In the United States and Europe? Yes, sure. That's being shaped right now. New York looked like it's going to be one of them. So will San Francisco, maybe Chicago. But for many, many others, no. That's why corporations don't want to pay taxes. Not here, someplace else, where their future lies. The United States is, as we call it in economics, a mature economy. Be very nervous when anyone applies that word to you. It means there's no growth here. This is not where the corporation's success and competitive strength will lie. It's over, and it hasn't sunk in. In the United States, the reason it didn't sink in was the fact that as the corporations left and the wages flattened out, if I had more time, and I did this a year ago when I was here, wages rose in the United States until the 1970s, and then they stopped rising, and they've never risen again. The real wage in the United States, that's the money you get adjusted for the prices you pay, is today what it was in 1977, same wage. The reason that didn't hit the American people like a punch in the face was because we developed a society that had a 30-year plan to avoid dealing with this problem. And that 30-year plan was debt. Americans can keep on living as if what I just described to you wasn't happening. How? By borrowing the money that they could no longer earn. Their spending went up because they borrowed more. We invented, for those of you who don't know, we invented whole new ways. In the 1970s, the only people who had a credit card were traveling businessmen and women from their company, American Express. That's it. There was a whole new idea to make sure that every one of you has 6 of these things in your wallet. Spend, spend, spend. In the 1970s, no students racked up the kinds of debts we now have. We've made college education a debt-encumbered phenomenon. Debt postponed the denouement, the French would call it, the confrontation. But you know, if you keep piling up debts and your real wage is flat, it's only a matter of time when the debt can't be paid off with the underlying income. That arrived in 2007. And that explains why an economic downturn of the sort that capitalism has every few years happened on such a scale that nobody in my profession foresaw. Not only did this crisis hit harder, last longer, trouble more people, but it has completely resisted the usual palliatives, the usual policies that are supposed to help it. Monetary policy from the Federal Reserve, fiscal policy from the government. We are using them big time, record-breaking amounts of that policy, but it isn't working because the underlying long-term problem isn't being addressed. Capitalists continue to leave, and the underlying capacity of this government or this economy to deal with this isn't even in question because most people have no idea what's going on. Very strange for those of us who discuss it, because we're talking to people who should be debating with us about it, but we're at an earlier stage. We got to explain, this is what's happening. So, for example, and I haven't the time to prove it to you, but I'm going to have to say it. There is no recovery. This endless babble about recovery is not there. It's true, the stock market has recovered a large distance, absolutely. And profits in corporations, they've done real well. But for the vast mass of the people, no. Real wages have continued to decline. The median income of the United States is 10% less today than at the beginning of the crisis in 2007. It's a straight line down. For the mass of American people, there's no recovery, nothing remotely like it. If you're in the 1, 2, 4, 6%, whatever it is, that owns the overwhelming majority of shares, you're doing okay. But that's it. There's nothing mysterious going on. There's no recovery, because where's it going to come from? Who's going to recover this economy? The corporations coming back? No sign. Oh yes, once in a while, the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal will have a story about a company that's closing 12 workers in Mexico and reestablishing them in the Bronx. It's really good. I'm very happy. In the flow of what's going on, this is something only a newspaper as devoted to fantasy as the New York Times would engage. There's nothing like this happening. The flow is all the other way. And by now, all the rest of the world understands this, is doing everything it can to bring that flow to their country. The Malaysians are struggling with the Thais, and the Thais with the Indians, and the Indians with the Chinese, and the Chinese with the Brazilians with the Nigerians. They all want it. And they're richer and able to get it with the active connivance of the United States, which does put no limits on the freedom of its businesses. That's, after all, the free enterprise system. The country in the world that has put the greatest set of obstacles to companies leaving is Germany. And Germany has not had a crisis the way we have. Germany's unemployment is straight down throughout the entire crisis. Ours shoots up and is now halfway back to what it was, which wasn't good. The Germans is straight down. That's why Mrs. Merkel got reelected. But lest you think that the Germans have escaped, don't. Germany is about to be governed by a coalition of its top two parties. The Conservative Party and the Socialist Party will join, as they did a few years ago, they're doing it again. That makes the party that came in third in the elections 3 weeks ago the only opposition. The name of that party is called the Die Linke Party, one of whose basic slogans is, Germany can do better than capitalism. Imagine that. 1 out of 12 Germans voted for them the other week. The New York Times, Merkel wins. This other little detail just escaped their notice. How strange. Well, what do we do about all this? We could, and it's sad that there are some amongst you who will go in this direction, we could decide, gee, we have to pass some laws and regulate and punish. Let's throw some bankers into jail, or let's establish a rule, I don't know, let's call it the Dodd-Frank bill or something like that, and hope that it fixes the situation. We did all that after the 1930s. Did it end the instability of capitalism? Not at all. Did it make sure we never have such a crisis again, which is what the people at the time promised it would? Obviously not. We're in one. The first time we tried all that regulations as what we could call reforms, we might be forgiven. Be nice if reforms worked, but they didn't. It is then possible to do them again, but that's a strange response when they didn't. So what do? You've got to do something more fundamental. And there's something available. It's not the classical response to capitalism's dysfunction. It's not the classical response. What's the classical response? Socialism and communism as we've had them in the last 150 years. But didn't work out too well. And one of the reasons they didn't is they made changes at the top. They changed the system of ownership from private to public. The government took over the enterprises. And they changed the distribution system. Instead of distributing resources and products by markets, you distribute them by planning. Very interesting. But what didn't change was the way you organize the core institution of the economy, which is the enterprise, the place where we work. That didn't change very much at all. You still had a small group of people who made all those decisions. What to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits. They weren't the private boards of directors selected by the major shareholders. That's how we do it in capitalism. It was government officials, the commissioners. They made those decisions. Interesting, different society, but it left the basic structure pretty much intact. And so what I'm going to suggest is what we have to do is what we were afraid to do. Change the basic structure. Not because it's a clever idea, not because it's an ideological goal, but because it's the only solution that's available. Here's what I mean. We don't anymore have a few people, board of directors, selected by major shareholders. Just to remind you, the top 5% of shareholders own 3/4 of the shares. So if we have a system of selecting the people who make the decisions in every corporation under the rule one share, one vote, which is the law in the United States, then we're effectively saying that decision making is in the hands of 4 or 5% of the shareholders, which are down to 1 or 2% of the population. That's how we do it. So my proposal is really simple. Don't do it that way anymore. Here's the idea. Should come as a surprise, maybe. I'm going to use the language Americans like. We just have to democratize the enterprise. Just think. Democracy, this simple idea, if you're going to be living with the results of a decision, then you ought to be participating in making it. You sort of have that right. That's the democratic idea. How interesting. In the communities we live, where we reside, we demand the right to select our mayor, our city council, our governor, and they must be responsible. How interesting. We leave the residence 5 out of 7 days a week, and we go to a place called the job. In the job, we spend most of our adult lives. A society committed to democracy exempts the place where they spend most of their lives. What? You go to work 5 out of 7 days. In that place, the decision, what you produce, how you produce, where you produce, whether you keep your job, and what's done with the profits you help to produce, all of which shape your life, you have no control or decision or participation in it at all. You can stay there or you can get the hell out. Participating in the decision making, not available. Never was. Stunning to call yourself a democratic society if the place where most of your adults spend most of their time is exactly organized in the opposite way. But I'll leave that to you to understand. You are Americans, like me, and this is a puzzle we'll all have to somehow solve. But my solution is do what should have been done in the first place. Democratize the enterprise. The workers become their own directors. They become self-determined. They have democratic rights over the economic reality of their lives. So now quickly, in my concluding minutes, let me give you an idea of where that might lead, so you can see why it's a solution. And these are just a few examples because I don't have much time. Example 1, decision to decide whether we close this factory here in Cincinnati and move it to Shanghai or not. Board of directors, shareholders, we move to Shanghai because the wages are low and we will make more profit. Workers, we moved it, not a chance, it's the end of my job. What will my wife say? What will my husband say? What will happen to the community? Well, the city will have no tax revenue. They won't be able to have the schools. Out. Next question. The whole movement out of Western Europe, North America, and Japan would have come to a grinding halt long ago. Second example. Here's a new technology. It's going to make our company twice as productive. It just has this unfortunate side effect. It pollutes the air. It spews crap into the air, which we all breathe. Now it raises the profit much more, but it pollutes the air. Board of directors in New York, meeting at the top of the Plaza Hotel. On the one hand, we make more profit. On the other hand, these workers will have to breathe this foul air. Let's see, it takes us 6-7 seconds to make that decision. We are going to go for the higher profits, and the worker who's not comfortable is free to leave. Workers gathered. On the one hand, we want to make more profit in this business, but we have to breathe that. Our relatives have to breathe it. Our children have to breathe it. The neighbors have, let's see. You want a green America? Here's your first chance. Or else you're just begging for a little bit of movement in that direction, and a little bit is all you're going to get. You want to make a change big, make the people who live with the results of not green, put them in the position of power. Third example. A lot of wailing and moaning is done in this country about our sad, troubling, and deepening gap between the rich and the poor. Unequal distributions of income and wealth, we are told, are leading to, gasp, corruption of our political system. Can you imagine? And so we should do something. We should do something to lessen the inequality. And good people have been saying that for decades. And they mean it. They don't get it, but they mean it. So here's a thought. Suppose we look and ask the question, what is the single most important cause of the widening gap between rich and poor? The answer there, I tell you as a professional economist, is real simple. It's how enterprises take the profits and divide them. The profit is the extra that is made by workers over and above the costs of the business, the net revenue. Simple idea. How do you distribute it? It turns out that the large corporations who do most of the business in the United States, as I told you, handful of major shareholders, select the board of directors, and they make the decisions. So this is now going to come as a real shock. The board of directors, selected by that handful of major shareholders, when it comes to dividing the surplus, the profits, here's what they do. This is going to surprise you. They give most of it to themselves. That's what they do. They do. That's why the top executives get, $40 million and perks for the rest of their life. That's why they get that. And the shareholders get the dividends. And it's wonderful. It's a real surprise. You, of course, would never do this. If you were in a position to distribute a huge amount of wealth, you would not give yourself a disproportionate amount. After all, we're in a church. But those people make these decisions, and they're not in a church, and that frees them. And what they have done is given more and more to themselves. How do you deal with that problem? Well, we could have a meeting, and we could tell them that it's not moral. But you all understand what that would get us. If we made the decision democratically as the workers, you think the workers in any enterprise would give all the money to a few people while they can't get their kids through a school? It would never happen. Would never happen. So I give you 3 examples. The loss of jobs and the end of the position of the United States, Western Europe, and Japan. could have been reversed by democratizing the work. The green revolution we want could have been achieved by democratizing the work. And the end of the inequality of wealth and income that is destroying everything could have been avoided if we had democratized the work. What possible excuse is there for not doing it? It extends democracy to economics, without which the political democracy was always a shell anyway. So, if anything I've told you sinks home about both the long term and the short term, then maybe the notion that we have to change at the base can catch hold as the only solution that's out there that has a chance to change this situation. Because if we don't visit Detroit, it is the future, and it's not a pretty sight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Wolff. So I think the rest of the, do you want to deliver your speech from there or over here?
I'll do it there.
All right, next up, Marc Armstrong, make him welcome.
So I'm going to be talking about a lot about public banks. They're common across the world. They're basically in every country except for England, Canada, the United States, and Australia. But the United States does have one public bank. It is in the People's Republic of North Dakota. And before I get to that, I want to read a quote that Chris Hedges included in one of his articles last week. And it's somewhat sobering, so it's going to serve as a segue from Dr. Wolff's wonderful presentation. So this quote is from Wendell Berry. "We Americans are not usually thought to be a submissive people, but of course we are. Why else would we allow our country to be destroyed? Why else would we be rewarding its destroyers? Why else would we all, by proxies we have given greedy corporations and corrupt politicians, be participating in its destruction? Most of us are still too sane to piss in our own cistern, but we allow others to do so, and we reward them for it. We reward them so well, in fact, that those who piss in our cistern are wealthier than the rest of us. How do we submit? By not being radical enough, or by not being thorough enough, which is the same thing." So I'm going to give a couple of examples of how we're being played. And they're from California, which is where I'm from. The San Francisco Bay Bridge opened up for passenger traffic this past September. And it's a beautiful bridge between Oakland and San Francisco, rebuilt after the '89 earthquake. And if you go back and look at the newspaper articles quoting the cost for that bridge, what's commonly known as it's $6.4 billion in materials and services. And if any of you recall, during the last 10, 15 years, as this was being built, the microscope was held to labor costs. And the USW fought a long fight, which they lost. Fabrication of the steel was done in China in order to save a few tens of millions of dollars. And the fabricated beams were shipped over and then installed as the new Bay Bridge. So this all cost $6.4 billion. A few tens of millions of dollars were saved by offshoring the labor to China. What was not mentioned is that the interest and fees for this bridge are another $6 billion. $6 billion that's going to be spent over the next 30 years, so that basically 55% of every $6 fee you pay to go over that bridge goes towards interest to the private bankers. That was never held under the microscope. And what we do at the Public Banking Institute is raise awareness that if you're going to cut costs on anything, cut costs on interest, because you can net it down to zero, and I'll give you an example later on. But another example of how the taxpayers are being played in California is with a report that came out in January. California Watch is a research organization. Wonderful report. I recommend it to anybody who wants to do the research. Search under California Watch and look at the capital appreciation bonds that were issued in the last 6 years. There was $9 billion of principal that was taken out by school districts throughout California. So that's the aggregate number. $9 billion in principal, and because the way these toxic bonds are structured, they don't have to be paid back for 25 years. The cost associated with this product, which is being generated right here in New York City, the cost is going to be another $27 billion of interest. So the future taxpayer, the occupied generation, is going to be hit with a bill of $36 billion to pay for the $9 billion that we've used in the last 6 or 7 years. So folks, this is the status quo, and that is how public finance is done. I would make the assertion that public finance has been completely 100% privatized, because that money goes to private organizations. They don't do it in North Dakota, and I'll explain that in a minute, but there are plenty of examples of how other countries just don't do it this way. Dr. Wolff was talking about Germany. After Fukushima, as a public policy, the German government committed to get off of nuclear energy. Now, we've heard public policies before which are very high-minded, but because the German government has a public bank established within the country of Germany, it can fund the effort to install solar and wind and other renewable energy projects. And so, I don't know if any of you follow it, but every May, new world records are being set in Germany with the amount of renewable energy that's being produced, the number of kilowatt hours being produced from the installations, which are being financed by their public banks. China, 2.5 years ago, committed, there was a big headline, they committed to build over 70 new airports within China within 4 years. Now, how can other countries do this, but we can't? You know, just the very thought of building a new airport would send fears up taxpayers' spines. And the reason why is because we limit ourselves to 4 choices. Whenever you're talking about a budget or how it's going to be paid for, our politicians and our government elected officials have 4 choices they talk about. One is to raise taxes, which they can't do anymore. The other is to cut expenses, which they've done more than enough. They can't do that anymore. The other is to sell off public assets, and so Chicago sells off its parking franchise, you know, for 20 cents on the dollar. And there are plenty of examples of how the commons is being sold in order to receive money to finance a new whatever it may be. I know in New Hampshire, the right-of-way for the train was sold recently. This was going to be the only, so now trains from Montreal to Boston cannot go through New Hampshire. They have to go around it because the right-of-way was sold. So those are 3 options. The 4th option is to do bonds, but many townships and states are bonded out. Okay, so those 4 options are what we limit our discussion to. They don't do that. They have those 4 options in North Dakota, but they've got another option as well, which is a public bank. So for instance, they wanted to build a water pipeline in the western part of the state. And you know, the taxpayers, the folks in North Dakota will say, you know, we don't spend more than we bring in. They don't. What they do is they have their public bank issue the loan to build the water pipeline, and then whatever interest is charged is paid by the people who are paying for the water. It's collected by the bank. The interest is collected by the bank, declared as profits, and then returned to the very same people, this very same economy from which the money came. So you end up with this closed circuit approach, and so it's just common sense. I mean, Why would you want to have an out-of-state organization loan you money when your brother or sister can loan you the money for a lot less, and the money stays in the family, which is essentially what it comes down to. So that's what public banking is in North Dakota, and this is one of the reasons. The cost savings is the key reason why folks do public banking. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about bank credit because it's important to understand this. I used to be in the technology world, and in the 80s, we were always asked, well, I know what a computer is, but what is software? Some of you may have said that to a number of folks. And so, people went through that learning process as to what software is. Bank credit is analogous to software in that it's a very simple algorithm. The algorithm is a double entry accounting system. And basically, by virtue of having money on one side of the double entry system, allows you to create the same amount on the other side. So if you have $100 of deposits, you can create $100 of loans. That's what we're all trained. But it's also true, if you have $100 of loans, that $100 of loans can be deposited in your same bank, and you basically have the two be equal, and you've essentially created a loan out of nothing. That's the nature of bank credit. It's the creation of money, and that is what the license is that we have given banks. And so public banking is all about saying, well, you know what? Maybe the people should have the license. The state should issue this banking license, and we use that tool to provide less costly public finance. So, bridges and other things don't cost as much as they do right now. So, just one more thing here. So the heart of a public bank is the loan programs. In North Dakota, there are 26 loan programs, and they use these loan programs to fund margins of their economy, to expand all sorts of new technology ventures, ventures having to do with dryland farming, other things that are not being funded by private banks. They're on the margins of the economy, and so because they're dedicated funding towards it, then you end up with growing the economy. You're taking on a little bit more credit risk, but because the bank is managed so well, their losses are really minimal. And the returns are off the charts. I won't get into the numbers, but a public bank is simply a way to bring focus on the economy, such as sustainable energy, such as new technologies, which are being overlooked by the existing private banking system. It is far more lucrative for private banks to take public funds from us and use those public funds to buy Brazilian bonds or equities in Chinese manufacturers, and that money is not reinvested in the communities from which it was originally issued as taxes. And so public banking is all about taking our money, okay, and which is in the form of taxes and fees that we pay to our county and city and county and state governments, and redirecting it from being placed into private banks, put into a public bank that's well managed, and then the credit is used locally. Now, just to end, the story behind the creation of the Public Bank of North Dakota is really interesting. It's over 93 years old, and in 1919 it was started. What happened before then is that there were a few, it was an agricultural state, so there were a few years when the mills that were owned by the railroads were not buying the grain. The farmers defaulted on their loans, and the banks, the out-of-state banks, then foreclosed on the farmers. So in one bill, the farmers established the Public Bank of North Dakota. They also established the state-owned flour mill of North Dakota. To this day, the largest bank in North Dakota is the Bank of North Dakota. The largest flour mill in the United States is the Flour Mill of North Dakota in the People's Republic of North Dakota. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark. That was very interesting. Next up, we're going to have Omar Freilla. Why don't you, unless you prefer to sit and speak. No, all right, come on up. Make him welcome.
Good evening. So I'm going to pick up where Rick left off on the question of democracy. And there's a question that I'm fond of asking people, and so I'll ask it in this audience, and I'm curious to see what the reaction is. How many of you have, and this is about your experience, so what I'm about to ask is not a trick question. So just answer it, whatever the first thing that comes to your mind is. You don't have to, do anything. So the question is, raise your hand. Well, it's a statement, actually. Raise your hand if you've experienced democracy in the past 7 days. Usually it takes a while for someone to ask that. Okay, great. So I see 3 hands. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 hands in the audience. All right. Raise your hands if you've experienced democracy in the past 30 days. Looks like the same people. Maybe 3, 4 more. Okay. So we've got about 12 people. How many people are here tonight? We've got a few. So that's a tiny number, and this happens to be the wealthiest. This is the wealthiest neighborhood in New York City. So I would imagine there's a high degree of education, and probably quite a number of you have advanced graduate degrees here, but only 12 people can say that they've experienced democracy. So the question of what do you mean by democracy? Well, I think of democracy as, I'm not going to answer that question actually, but something to keep in mind is, I'll ask another question. How many of you have experienced not democracy, how many of you have experienced gravity in the past 7 days? Okay, all right. So pretty much everyone raised their hands. Those of you who did not, well, that's another story. But all of you have an idea, a very clear idea of what I mean by gravity. And that's because it's something that you experience, or you think you experience it, you learned what it is a long time ago, and each and every single day you have this idea that there's something that keeps me from flying off the planet, and that's gravity. And you experience it each and every day. So democracy is one of those things that you don't experience it. Rick talked earlier about just the fact that we live in societies, we go to spend most of our time at work in places where we don't experience democracy. It operates more as a feudal system. So in our daily lives, where we spend most of our days, at work, and even from much younger than that, we grow up in schools, and schools have been designed to make us very good employees for many people. So we go to school, we sit in rows, much like you're all sitting here in rows, you're listening to a teacher talk, like you're listening to me talk, and then you go work for someone who tells you exactly what you're supposed to be doing, and you do what you're told, and you produce product for someone else. And those are our days. So we don't get the experience of actually making decisions, coming together as a group, coming to a compromise or coming to a collective decision about where we want to go, and having to take that on. And there are skills that go along with that. There are skills about communication and how we listen, how we arrive at decisions. So those are very deep ingrained skills that make it possible for people to come together and to do things without killing each other, without getting frustrated and emotions flaring and people getting upset and not wanting to talk to each other anymore. So those are things that you learn when you're actually engaged in the process of democracy. So I think of democracy as really a muscle that we get to use. If you don't use it, then it withers away, and it really becomes of no use. And that's how we wind up with politicians that get to do whatever they want, that are beholden to corporate interests or other interests other than ours, because we're not really holding them to account, because we don't really have the skills to hold people to account, because we're not learning it in our day-to-day experience. So something where Rick ended is really where I want to pick up, and that's the question of, well, how does it show up and how can we actually create it? So Rick talked about democratizing work. It's not just a fancy concept, or wouldn't it be nice if, but there is very much a movement that has been happening in this country, and it's a very old movement, and it's a movement that predates capitalism, but it's the concept that people are coming together, and they're coming together engaged in some kind of an entity, a business structure, and they're engaging in business together as equals. They own it together. These days we call it cooperatives, a cooperative business. But it's something that's actually very old. It's the way when you look at traditional societies, nomadic or hunter-gatherers, these are the ways that societies were structured. You had people who were engaged in something together, and they did the work together. Of course, because they're doing the work together, they're making decisions together about how they're going to distribute resources to each other. So the idea of cooperatives is something that it's been gaining increasing traction, but when you look at the larger economy, certainly it's not even a drop in the bucket. It's a tiny fraction of a fraction of a fraction. Today in the United States, the estimates are anywhere between 250 to 400 cooperatives, worker-owned cooperatives. And when I say worker-owned cooperatives, I mean specifically the kinds of cooperatives where people who are working together, they spend their days together, they're making decisions, they actually own it. A cooperative generally, so for those of you who may not be familiar, a cooperative is any entity, any business entity that's owned and managed, governed by its members, by the people that make its members. And these are people who come together to meet a common need, so whatever it is. So there are cooperatives in all sectors of the economy. In every different area you can find a cooperative. New York City actually has quite a number of cooperatives, but we don't necessarily hear about them because what we hear about are the Bank of Americas, we hear about the Chase, we hear about the Starbucks, but we don't hear about this other kind of entity. But there are a number of different kinds. Housing cooperatives. How many people here are familiar with housing cooperatives? Of course. So housing cooperatives, very, very plain and simple. It's the people who live there who are the members. They're the ones who own the building. So you own it, you live in a unit in an apartment building that has 40 units, you own 1/40th of the building. That's a cooperative. Credit unions are another form of cooperatives. These are cooperatives of consumers. People are coming together and they own something as consumers. You have cooperatives of businesses or independent businesses that come together. So most people, you go shop at a supermarket, the food that winds up there more than likely came through Hunts Point in the Bronx, out of the Hunts Point meat, produce, or fish markets. Those are structured as cooperatives, where you have independent businesses that come together, they all have one name, they have one lease with the city, and that's structured as a cooperative. That's another kind of cooperative. There's a third kind of cooperative, and this is the kind of cooperative that I'm a big fan of, we're fans of at Green Worker Cooperatives. And it's the kind of cooperative that leads to creating that space where people are engaged in democratic decision-making, and that's what's known as a worker cooperative. And this is a pretty unique in terms of the kind of business structure that it is, and it's the kind of business structure that really flips the model of a capitalist enterprise on its head. Because what it does is that it says that the people who are actually doing the work, who are spending their days in and out of the business, engaged in the work and who are out in the field, these are the people who have just as much right to own the enterprise as anyone else. In fact, more so. So in a cooperative across the board, its members are the ones who have ownership. And ownership gives you two rights in this society. Ownership gives you a right to profits, and it gives you a right to make decisions. Those are two things that come with ownership. So in a business that's owned by its workers, it's the workers then that are saying, we own this enterprise, we own this business, we're the ones who have the say in what happens, and we're the ones who gain in the profits. So in the examples that Rick gave, if you have a business that's owned by its workers, the workers are more likely going to be living in the neighborhood, and these are the people at the end of the year when profits get distributed, those profits stay with the workers. That means that there's more money that can be spent in the community, more money that's spent at the local bodega or the supermarket, more money that's spent at a movie theater if there is a movie theater, more money that's spent at a local newsstand, wherever it is, wherever people are going. But that's just more money that actually stays in the community. This is something that we have seen, those of us who have been involved in the movement for economic democracy and the movement for worker cooperatives, we've been able to actually create more of these cooperatives and really played a factor, been a factor in the creation of more of these cooperatives. This is an area where there's a high degree of potential for really transforming the economy and creating true accountability in our communities, creating the accountability in the sense of making it possible so that we actually can have a sustainable environment or a sustainable economy, one that actually respects the communities that they're in, and actually one that is able to really transform people's lives. It makes a huge difference when you are in a position from having been an employee all your life to now being an owner and being engaged in decision making and actually being able to have a say in what happens in the business. I founded 10 years ago an organization called Green Worker Cooperatives with the intent that what we will do and what we do is to actually start up worker-owned cooperative businesses in New York City, particularly in the Bronx, where we're based and where I'm from. And the reason for that was because the Bronx, very unlike the Upper East Side, has been the poorest part of New York City. It's an area that has also been on the losing end of the city's environmental battles for many years. And it is the part of the city, along with a few other parts of the city, where if you want to find the dirtiest infrastructure and the things that no one else wants, then that's where you go. So, when we turn on the lights here, we turn on lights, we flush toilets, they wind up, the infrastructure for that is in places like the South Bronx. So it's where your wastewater treatment plants are, where your electric power generating facilities are, where your waste facilities are. Some of it, a good number of it, because of the sale of public assets, is now in private hands. And so we have private industries that are popping up and making their home in communities with the least ability to fight back, typically low-income communities and communities of color. And so those industries operate without concern for the communities that they're operating in. When they have smokestacks, the smokestacks don't point in the homes of their shareholders who don't live in the Bronx. The smokestacks point within enough distance so that it covers the area of the immediate area surrounding the facility. And so this impacts the people who are living there, the people who are working there. So really creating accountability in our economy and really leading to environmental sustainability is really about creating that accountability structure and creating that where we don't have that. So worker cooperatives are a great way of doing that because it's about, at the end of the day, creating accountability. And it's about connecting the work that's being done to the communities that surround the work, to the workers who are actually there doing the work. And so that's the reason why we're just big fans of worker co-ops. We see it as a great way to really achieve those ends. Again, it's a small sector of the economy, and so it's one that many people who believe in this have really been working for quite a while to grow. 10 years ago when I started Green Worker Cooperatives, there was one worker cooperative in New York City, and that was Cooperative Home Care Associates. They're based in the Bronx. Wow, the time has gone quickly. So Cooperative Home Care Associates based in the Bronx, 2,000 workers doing home health care aides. These are home health care workers. They've made tremendous strides in their industry and been able to push the industry, all home health care workers, by really being a cooperative and really being able to raise and increase the level of standards that are there for worker-owned businesses and for home health care across the board. That's something that we are pushing, and we are creating more of these. A few years ago, we started something that we call the Co-op Academy. And so it's our boot camp, a cooperative business boot camp for people who have an idea, who want to start up a worker cooperative. And that's something where people go through, they have an idea, we help them to launch it and make it happen. So we've had everything from we have one cooperative called Ginger Moon that provides chef services for new mothers. We have a group of interpreters, potential for taxis. We have a number of others, all across the sectors, different industries. But at the end of the day, what distinguishes them from a traditional business is their ownership. The fact that the people who are working there, they have a say, they have a stake in the business, and they're connected to the communities that they're operating in. And this is something that, if implemented and spreads across the board, really dramatically revolutionizes our economy and the way we operate, and it redefines work. But it has implications beyond that, because it leads then to the skills that we have as each of us as individuals in terms of how we actually make decisions on a personal level. I think it makes you a better husband. It makes you a better, makes you a better wife, it makes you a better partner, because it's about communication and learning to communicate with other people that you don't necessarily agree with. So these are things that are really about mending, creating new social relationships that have been broken for a long time within the economic system that we operate under. But creating that and getting to that next level then is something that requires some radical rethinking, and it requires radical investment, and it requires really creating and pushing the envelope to create the kind of economy that we want. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, last up before I have my go at all of you is Alexis Goldstein, who, it cannot be stated enough, co-hosts a radical finance and economics podcast with the almost too good-looking Jesse Myerson. It's called Disorderly Conduct, and it can be found online at tarbell.com/discon, tarbellnyc.com/discon, DISCON, for disorderly conduct. Alexis Goldstein, ladies and gentlemen.
So thanks for staying. I know it's getting late. What I'm going to try and do is talk a little bit about how we might address some of the problems in our individual lives. And I'm going to try and give you a lot of choices, so that maybe it's kind of like a buffet, and maybe you don't want the macaroni and cheese, but maybe you want the seitan or the tofu or the steak, whatever, you pick what you want. So that's my goal. Before I get started into that, though, I took notes on what everybody said, and there's, I can talk about that for 10 minutes, but one thing that I think is important to keep at the forefront of our minds is we're in a lot of ways fighting a war of ideology, and I think that if I were to identify one ideology that is the most important one to fight, it is the idea, it's an old one, it is might makes right, but the way that materializes is meritocracy. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. If you're rich, you deserve it. If you're poor, you're stupid and lazy. And if I could just put out one pitch, I just read a really good article by a woman named Tressie McMillan. She's a PhD student at Emory. She studies a lot of things, but one of the things that she studies is for-profit colleges and how predatory they are. She just wrote an article called The Logic of Stupid Poor People, which is a very tongue-in-cheek, sarcastic article. She's at Tressie, Tressie, Mick, PhD, MC, PhD. It's a really good article. I would definitely recommend that you read it. But I'll just read you the very first sentences. And again, please note that this is sarcastic. We hate us some poor people. First, they insist on being poor when it is so easy to not be poor. Then they do things like buy expensive designer belts and $2,500 luxury handbags. And then she sort of goes on to sort of deconstruct the anger that society has at poor people who dare to try to, keep up with the Joneses, so to speak. So all of that aside, I want to talk about kind of 4 different categories of things about how we can combat all of these problems. Something practical, something radical, something institutional, and then a hybrid. So the easiest one, the most practical one, is to move your money. So just as a show of hands, who has moved at least one account away from Wall Street and into a credit union or a small bank? At least one, maybe not all your money, but one. All right, so everyone who hasn't raised your hand yet, get on that. So that's the first thing. The next thing is working within institutions and working within the system as we have it. And one of my favorite groups that came out of the Occupy Wall Street movement is a group called Strike Debt. Raise your hand if you've heard of them. Okay, most of you. So they do a lot of things. One of the things that they've been doing a lot of is trying to write more about what government could be doing. And there was an article recently where they were talking about how public education could be free. And they identified that the cost of tuition at all public universities was $60 billion, if you add them all up. And in 2010, basically almost $9 billion were Pell Grants that were given to for-profit colleges. I don't have time to tell you why for-profit colleges are bad and predatory, so you'll just have to either take my word for it or do your own research. But they took that $9 billion, then they found out that $1.6 billion of the GI Bill is also going to for-profit colleges. So you have about $10 billion right there. Then they took out a bunch of tax breaks, and they basically did the math and said, we only need $13 billion more, and we can make every public institution in this country free, tuition free. And so I think that's an important thing to do, is we need to move the needle, right? And so another way that you can do that is you can advocate for ideas like that, but it still involves trying to change things within institutions. Another thing that you could do is you could talk about just go radical. And Strike Debt has also been good about this. They've talked a lot about debt resistance and whether or not our debts are even legitimate. So you can look at this in the sense of, are the debts legal? Or you can look at it in the sense of, are the debts moral? So in terms of, are the debts moral, if you think about the 2008 financial crisis, a lot of it came about because banks went into poor communities and tried to encourage people to take on loans that they couldn't afford. They actually, in many cases, put bounties on the heads of members of communities of color, often, elderly black women in the community or people in the churches, and they put bounties on their head to try and get them to take out, refinance their home. They own their home outright. They did not have a mortgage, but maybe they needed another source of income. So that's the moral question. But then there's the legal question. So there is actually a group, it started in France, it's called the International Citizen Debt Audit Network, and their motto is don't owe, won't pay. And essentially what they do is they get together into groups and they look at all of the debts that their city or their country has. And they look into whether or not they think that those debts are legitimate. And for example, in parts of Europe, you are not allowed to use public money for financial speculation. It is not legal. But some of the public loans that have been made in France, after the first few years, skyrocket to 25% interest, which is disgusting. And so they allege that that is an illegal loan, and they, in some parts of Europe, have refused outright to pay the debts. And so Strike Debt did an interview with this debt audit network, trying to get this idea kind of growing here in the United States. Could we as communities get together and think about whether or not our debts are legitimate? Are the debts in Detroit that are often to Wall Street banks legitimate? They want to raid the pensioners, but why don't we just not pay Goldman Sachs? Jefferson County in Alabama was bankrupted because of swaps that they had with JP Morgan Chase. So having a debt audit network is another idea that's more on the radical end. Most of you will already know about it, so I'll try to be brief, but another Strike Debt project was the Rolling Jubilee. This raised, I believe, $500,000 to essentially buy debt in the secondary market. So normally if a bank believes you will not pay off your loan, and they give up, they get to take a tax write-off on the amount of money that your debt is still outstanding. But then they get to double dip, and they get to sell that debt in the secondary market for pennies on the dollar. So they get the tax write-off, and then they get to sell it for a little bit of money. So instead of debt collectors buying up that debt, Strike Debt, through the Rolling Jubilee Project, bought it up and then abolished the debt. And they tried to pick communities across the country and spread it out. They're gonna have a big announcement on November 15th. They have not yet told me what that is about, so I don't have any inside information, but you should definitely watch out for that. As I understand it, they have spent the remainder of the money and they will be announcing it mid-November. And then there's the Debt Resisters Operations Manual, which is due for an update and will be updated soon, but it's essentially a really it has a radical name, but it's extremely practical. How do you write a letter to the credit ratings agency? How do you contest some errors in your credit report? How do you fight someone who's calling you and harassing you and threatening, as some debt collectors have done, and this is on file with the FCC in a complaint? A poor woman took out a loan to pay for the funeral for her daughter, and the debt collector called her up and said, if you do not pay this debt, I will dig up your daughter. And so, they're lovely people, really. And so that's some things along the more radical lines. We can say to the banks, You bankrupted the country. You crashed the economy. We do not accept your debt as legitimate. And then you can flow into the moral angle to that. So if you think about the Bible, right, and I am not a biblical scholar, so grain of salt, every 7 years there is a jubilee. And the idea is that we are just stewards of the land. We don't own the land, right? Just, and I'm basically an atheist, so it's sort of weird for me to talk about this, but, God gave the land to, us, and we're just the stewards. And so every 7 years, all debts are abolished. And I meant to bring it out. I did not. I will bring them out after if anybody wants them. I have about 10 copies. There's a magazine called Tidal, and there was an article all about this and all about the role of faith-based institutions in fighting back against debt and fighting this moral idea, right? There's so much in our ideology and in the political landscape of not just is it immoral for individuals not to pay our debt, but it is immoral for the government not to pay their debt. And so this is like a really key concept in terms of keeping austerity going. So the more that we can push back on that and say, actually, I think religion doesn't say that. And even if you're not religious, that's kind of, maybe being a jerk about it. I don't know. I think that is an important thing to do. So the last item in my buffet of things for you to potentially plug into is what I like to think of as a hybrid. And that's something that's coming out of Richmond, California that you've likely heard about, the eminent domain issue. Show of hands, who's heard of this? Right. So it's Richmond, California, essentially on a vote of 4-3 in their city council voted to use the powers of eminent domain to seize underwater mortgages, write them down to the current level of market value of the home, and refinance the mortgage to keep the person in their home. Now, the people that came up with this idea is a group called MRP, Mortgage Resolution Partners, and in my personal opinion, they're like kind of Wall Street scum, but it's Wall Street scum fighting other Wall Street scum, so it kind of works out. What's great about this is eminent domain usually works in the reverse, right? We buy off people, we force them off their land, we build a stadium that costs the state a huge amount of money, lines the pockets of some private corporation, we get caught with the check, everybody loses. This is it in reverse. Wall Street is terrified by this concept because it interferes with their profits and it interferes with this concept that is basically Wall Street's gospel. It's something called the sanctity of the contract. If you remember during the debate around should the AIG executives get paid and should their contracts be honored, even though we bailed them out, they were like, we must honor the contract, the sanctity of the contract. But it's interesting because when you're talking about the contract of the pensioners in Detroit or another, somehow the teachers, the contracts all of a sudden don't matter. So even though I don't like MRP, who are the people bringing this to Richmond, California, this is an incredible idea because it reimagines the way that we think of the state and could the state work for the people instead of on behalf of private interests. And so I see that as more of a hybrid model. It's not totally institutional, it's a little bit radical, so you can kind of mix the two up. So, all that being said, I haven't gotten my time warning, so I'll segue into one other thing, which is that I just want to put in a good word for Dodd-Frank because I feel like it's really maligned. I believe that we don't have to choose between reform or revolution because I don't think we're quite yet at the cusp of revolution. I think like once we're on the way to revolution, let's just go with revolution. But like there needs to be an A to B to C to D. And so I just want to tell you a quick story in my remaining time that's depressing but has a silver lining. So part of Dodd-Frank was something called swaps push-out. So swaps are kind of derivative. The idea was we shouldn't be able to let the big banks hold their swaps in the part of the bank that has FDIC insurance. Now, this gets a bit complicated, but the banks pay into a fund called the DIF, the Deposit Insurance Fund, all banks, big banks, small banks, community banks. And if one of the banks goes under, they dip into that deposit insurance fund. So if Citigroup were to go belly up tomorrow, in some ways, that deposit insurance fund would represent a bailout of small banks, of Citigroup by small banks and big banks. This swaps push-out part of Dodd-Frank was basically like, we shouldn't have swaps in the part of the bank with this nice deposit insurance fund to begin with. The FDIC is the one organizing this. It seems risky, let's not do it. So there was a bill that came up before the House Financial Services Committee in May and passed the House today, called HR 992. And it basically was like, this swaps push out thing, it's a stupid idea, let's not do it. Let's let the banks hold all of their risky swaps in the part of the bank with FDIC insurance. Which, by the way, the reason they want to do that is that part of the bank has a higher credit rating. And just like if my credit rating is high, I can borrow for cheaper. If my credit rating is low, I have to borrow for more money. This makes borrowing cheaper for the banks. That's important for Citigroup because Citigroup's a terrible bank, which I just mentioned. I used to work on Wall Street. I can't probably say this, but the way that the name for Citigroup on Wall Street is Shitty Group. They have to pay a premium for anyone who wants to work there because no one wants to work there. Anyway, Citigroup wrote 70 out of 85 lines of this bill. Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley don't really care about this because they've already pushed all their stuff out. Okay, so why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this for two reasons. One, Wall Street still writes our bills and our laws. But two, if Dodd-Frank was so awful, Citigroup wouldn't have spent the money, the time, the resources. They wouldn't have panicked. They wouldn't have bought and sold a representative named Jim Himes, who's out of Connecticut, who's the #1 recipient of donations from Citigroup, who's been the hero advocating for this bill. If Dodd-Frank were so pointless, they wouldn't bother. Now, I'm not saying Dodd-Frank is the answer. It's definitely not. We need a revolution. But I will say that because of immense public blowback, news stories, a New York Times article about how the House of Representatives is an ally of Wall Street, this bill, it was still passed, but it passed by a much lower margin than was anticipated. So the reason I bring that up is even in a fight where the odds are so stacked against us like that, headline risk matters. The fourth estate matters, and us speaking out matters. So hopefully there's something in that buffet that I just presented that might be vaguely interesting to you. I will have some titles after. I'll go grab them after the presentation if anybody wants one. And and hopefully that's a semi-positive note to end the speeches on.
Excellent.